It's my pleasure to welcome Clive Hamilton to CSBA to discuss his book, Silent Invasion, on China's political warfare and economic statecraft in Australia. I'm Tom Mankin. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of CSBA. And this is a topic of great interest to us at CSBA. Later this month, as a matter of fact, we'll be releasing a monograph on Chinese and Russian political warfare, co-authored by myself, my colleague Toshi Yoshihara, and my colleague Ross Babbage. And this report will be the first fruit of a larger research program on that topic. That's what's coming. But as to today, Silent Invasion has been, I think it's fair to say, a controversial book, even before its publication. And I was lucky enough, I think, to pick up one of the first copies to hit the shelves when I was in Sydney a few months ago. More importantly, it's a thought-provoking book, outlining Chinese influence operations in one of America's closest allies. And I think it's a topic of interest not only because it involves a close ally, but because those influence operations aren't confined to Australia. So we'll begin with a presentation by Clive Hamilton, Professor Clive Hamilton, who is, in addition to being the author of this book, is Professor of Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University in Canberra. And then after Professor Hamilton's presentation, we'll have a question and answer discussion session, and we'll take it from there. So with that, Clive Hamilton, welcome to CSBA. Thanks, Clive.
Thanks very much, Tom. I appreciate that introduction and indeed the invitation to speak at CSBA. Well, my background isn't in China studies, but in politics and public policy. Actually, my PhD many years ago was in economics, the economics of development. But I decided to write Silent Invasion in 2016 when it became obvious from newspaper stories that Chinese Communist Party interference in Australian politics is serious and demands attention. And in conversations with China experts, always the first port of call when you're starting a new area of research, I soon established that the problem is much deeper than I realised. And indeed, as the months went past, as I researched and then wrote this book, it became deeper and deeper. My usual publisher, a highly respected independent company, dropped the book at a late stage, citing fear of retaliation against the company by Beijing. It was an unwelcome vindication of the essential argument of the book. And my dismay was compounded as I realised that the shadow cast by Beijing is dark enough to frighten off the rest of the Australian publishing industry, with, of course, the honourable exception of Hardy Grant. The Chinese Communist Party's long-term objective is to absorb Australia into its sphere of influence and shift Australia away from its alliance with the United States. The objective was decided in 2004 when the Central Committee of the party resolved to include Australia in China's overall periphery. That is, to regard it like countries that have a land border with China and therefore needing to be controlled. The CCP views Australia as a weak link in the American alliance, and as a European nation located in Asia, a major prize in its push for strategic dominance across the Asia-Pacific region. So Australia forms the weak link in its view because it's heavily dependent on the PRC for trade and increasingly investment, giving many influential Australians a personal stake in keeping Beijing contented. It's a relatively small nation with a large Chinese diaspora, numbering some 1.3 million people of Chinese heritage, or 5% of the population, many of whom Beijing believes it can mobilise to support its ideological, economic and political objectives. And thirdly, Australia's open multicultural society provides more opportunities for influence activities aided by a widespread fear in mainstream society of accusations of racism, which I've dubbed a phenomenon that I've dubbed xenophobia phobia. Australia has accordingly been the target of the full force of the CCP's sophisticated influence and interference operations. So how has the party gone about it? Well, the essential argument of the book is that the CCP is being engaged in a thoroughgoing, systematic campaign to shift elite opinion in Australia so that decision makers act in ways conformable with Beijing's wishes. The principal forms of influence work can be divided up according to the departments of the CCP Central Committee tasked with carrying them out. And they are the United Front Work Department, the Propaganda Department, and the International Department. And to these we should add the so-called political warfare carried out by the Liaison Department of the People's Liberation Army, which uses psychological operations to win friends and disintegrate enemies in order to, quote, shape and define the discourse of international relations, in the words of Stokes and Sowell. Reinforcing the work of these agencies, the PRC uses what I call offensive diplomacy, employing economic threats or implied threats as its most powerful weapon. As its economic power has grown, the PRC has raised the use of economic statecraft to a very high level. And in this domain, it has a decisive advantage over the West because the PRC economy, including private corporations, can be controlled by the party, and because economic lobby groups hold little sway over the party. In other words, the PRC can take more pain than democratic nations. One powerful tactic is known as Yi Shang Bi Zheng, the use of business to pressure government. Now, I noted a couple of weeks ago, the 11th of April, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal saying that the business coalition opposing White House plans to levy tariffs against Chinese goods has doubled to 107 trade groups. In choosing its targets for tariff retaliation, Beijing selected industries that are particularly vulnerable to the loss of Chinese markets and are able to exert political pressure on the Trump administration. And it shows how the Chinese Communist Party has become highly skilled at exploiting the weaknesses of Western democratic systems. It mobilises domestic forces within its rivals to do its political work in a way that Western nations simply cannot match in China. And this example illustrates the primary argument that I'm making today, that China's ability to use its strengths and our weaknesses to erode resistance to it from within the nations it's dealing with. And democracies don't know how to counter this strategy. Here, my main focus is on United Front work, which, under Xi Jinping, has assumed much greater prominence in the CCP's conduct of foreign relations. Every embassy and consulate must implement United Front policies, even more so in the context of the rollout of the Belt and Road Initiative. In the West, United Front work has traditionally been aimed at suppressing dissidents, winning overseas Chinese to the CCP cause, and mobilising them to act in support of Beijing's political and strategic interests. United Front work aims to influence the choices, direction and loyalties of its targets by overcoming negative perceptions and promoting favourable perceptions of CCP rule in China. It relies on psychological techniques of manipulation and behavioural control that have been carefully developed and tested over many years. A teaching manual for United Front cadres notes, the unity of Chinese at home requires the unity of the sons and daughters of Chinese abroad. United Front activity intensified, as I said, when Xi Jinping became Communist Party General Secretary in 2012, and have expanded each year since. In 2014, President Xi declared, as long as the overseas Chinese are united, they can play an irreplaceable role in realising the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, as they are patriotic and rich in capital, talent, resources and business connections. Xi designated Chinese students studying abroad as a new and important focus for United Front work. In Australia over the last 20 or so years, the PRC has succeeded, perhaps beyond its expectations, in suppressing voices critical of the party, primarily those organisations campaigning for democracy, for Tibetan autonomy, Taiwanese independence, and for rights of Falun Gong practitioners. They are barely heard today in either the mainstream or the Chinese language media in Australia. In the 2000s, trusted individuals sympathetic to the CCP infiltrated most of the established Chinese community groups and professional associations in Australia. Earlier generations of Chinese Australians tell of meetings at long-standing social and professional associations where they were taken over by new members with pro-Beijing sympathies, and the old executives were voted out. In addition, many new organisations have been established that take a pro-Beijing position. They include, especially from the early 90s, student associations on campuses across Australia, various business organisations, and a number of professional organisations for ethnic Chinese experts or scientists in Australia. And the effect has been that pro-Beijing elements are now seen in the mainstream as representing the Chinese community in Australia and are often reported that way by the mainstream media. Politicians have been naively willing to associate with them. From the early 1990s, the foremost objectives of United Front work concentrated on suppressing critical voices and winning over Chinese Australians to the CCP cause. But in more recent years, it has increasingly, that is United Front work, been oriented towards promoting a more favourable view of the PRC and the Communist Party in the Australian mainstream. Effort has been directed at countering negative perceptions of CCP rule and highlighting the positives through co-opting and cultivating elites. The strongly pro-Beijing views of sections of elite opinion in Australia today testifies to the success of this campaign. An organisational chart of United Front influence activities in Australia is shown in this figure. United Front work falls under the aegis of the Politburo of the CCP Central Committee rather than state agencies, although those of you watching closely would have noticed that, particularly since the 19th Party Congress, that state agencies are being devoured by party bodies. The third bureau of the United Front Work Department is tasked with carrying out influence operations among ethnic Chinese communities abroad. And if I can just zoom in towards the top of this so you can see it a bit more clearly. These are conducted by 4 agencies of the United Front Work Department, the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, the All China Federation of Returned Overseas Chinese, the China Council for Promotion of Peaceful National Reunification, and just below that, the China Overseas Friendship Association. So I won't go into details about those. You have to learn a lot of acronyms when you start to study the United Front Work Department. But I just want to draw your attention to the China Council for the Promotion of Peaceful National Reunification. And if I zoom in at the bottom of this chart, it'll be a bit clearer where I'm going with this. Now, this organisation is especially important for its work in Australia, where it's represented by the Australian Council for the Promotion of Peaceful Reunification of China, the ACPPRC, the box on the bottom row, second from the left. This has been described recently as the overarching organisational vehicle in Australia for helping coordinate smaller United Front bodies in Australia. Now, media attention on the activities and CCP links of the ACPPRC and its controversial former president, Mr. Huang Zhangmo, has been instrumental in raising public awareness of the United Front in Australia. Its central organising and guiding role for many other Chinese Australian organisations is the reason that that is the ACPPRC, warrants its own box in this chart, which is based, incidentally, on a more complicated one drawn up by James Toe, a New Zealand academic who's wrote a brilliant but much neglected book on Chow Wu work arising out of his thesis. Now, in the third box on the left here, which I've dubbed other overseas Chinese organisations, I've grouped, although not named, a range of United Front organisations, including, I've got a list of them here, yes, hometown associations, such as, an example, there are many of them, the Australian Federation of Shenzhen Associations, Australian Ningbo Association. There's also business associations, such as the China Chamber of Commerce in Australia and the Australia-China Belt and Road Initiative. Ethnic Chinese professional and scientific associations, a couple of them are the Federation of Chinese Scholars in Australia and the Western Australia Chinese Scientists Association. Cultural and heritage groups, including dance troupes and writers' organisations, like the Australian Chinese Writers Association, and a couple of other kinds of groups. The Chinese... how do you go backwards? That's the question. It's all right. The Chinese Students and Scholars Associations, which I put in a box in the chart, I can't go backwards for some reason, are a further category. They're integral, an integral component of United Front work, and they're aimed mainly at, of course, they're all over the United States and have attracted quite a lot of attention here, CSSAs. Their work is aimed primarily at monitoring the thoughts and behaviours of the 178,000 Chinese students on campuses across Australia. As I point out in the book, this is at least 5 times higher per capita than the number of Chinese students in the United States. More recently, these organisations, CSSAs, have been at the centre of brazen attempts to close down free speech on Australian campuses by organising online protests and calling in consular staff to pressure universities to discipline staff members who make statements contrary to Beijing's position. Just a comment on Chinese language media. All but a few of the Chinese language newspapers and radio stations in Australia are now controlled by pro-Beijing elements. These media, I can't go back unfortunately. I don't know what to do here. Here it is again. I'll try and start again if I can. So if you see overseas Chinese media at the bottom left there, you can see that they're controlled indirectly by the United Front Work Department, influenced by the propaganda department through Xinhua News Agency and other party-affiliated media outlets in China, and they operate through overseas Chinese media in Australia. And what they do is they communicate to the diaspora, the CCP view of the world. They also foment patriotic feelings and amplify official messages. At times they help promote nationalistic gatherings, like demonstrations in Melbourne, for instance, in 2016 against the Hague Tribunal's ruling on the South China Sea. Psychological techniques applied in United Front work have been, as I suggested, developed and refined by the party over decades, and are taught to cadres with the help of classified manuals. James Toe observes that the techniques applied to both Chinese and non-Chinese alike are effective tools for intensive behavioural control and manipulation while appearing to be benign, benevolent and helpful. And they have certain unique features. Just to pick out a couple, by cultivating warm personal relationships, influence activities aim to shape thinking and attitudes so that they're more favourably disposed to the PRC's interests when expressing an opinion or taking some kind of action. They therefore have a high level of deniability, and this is how the word friendship should be understood when used by the Chinese Communist Party. The party is content to gradually build organisations, networks and friendships across years and even decades. It's not unusual for the embassy or the consulates to identify potential leaders in Australian politics, business, the military, intelligence agencies, universities, when they're at the start of their careers and cultivate them over years. United Front organisations in Australia now are in the process of identifying and training a new cohort of young Chinese Australian community leaders suited to moving into positions of leadership in 10 or 20 years' time. To understand how the various agencies and techniques come together to achieve the party's goals, it's helpful now just to flip our perspective from the weapons of United Front to their targets. And the targets, as I suggested, are the leading elites in Australia. So let me just comment briefly on the first three of these. There's much more in my book about the others. So for want of time, I'll just very briefly comment on the first three to give you an idea. With political elites, elements of the diaspora have been put to good use targeting Australia's political leaders. One favoured avenue is to draw them into engagement with Chinese community organisations like the Australian Council for the Promotion of Peaceful Reunification of China, and also to draw them into cultural activities like Chinese New Year celebrations, which have been taken over by pro-Beijing elements and even funded from Beijing. And so Chinese New Year's celebrations are now used to foster personal relationships with political leaders and establish feelings of reciprocity. Although through these contacts, a PRC or CCP view of the world is absorbed and becomes accepted as Chinese view of the world. In addition, large donations to political parties by wealthy Chinese or Chinese Australian businessmen have oiled the process of engagement. Unlike typical donations from corporations, nothing immediate is expected in return. And in fact, it was this conundrum that really puzzled me at the outset. I mean, I decided to write this book when there was a scandal emerged in the newspapers in August, September 2016, when it became apparent that a small number of wealthy Chinese or Chinese Australian business people had become the major donors to Australia's principal political parties. And I started to puzzle, well, why are they doing it? And one of them, Huang Zhangmo, said, we don't want anything in return. And there was a certain truth in that, oddly enough, because typically when a corporation or industry group makes a large donation to a political party, they want something. They want the media laws changed, or they want resource rent tax abolished or reduced, or they want the competition laws changed to allow big mergers or something like that. But there was no obvious ask attached to these very large donations, which, when added up, came to many millions of dollars. It actually doesn't take very much to buy a political party in Australia. When the ACPPRC president, Huang Zhangmo, reportedly demanded that the Labor Party, in opposition, change its policy on the South China Sea if it wanted to receive a promised $400,000 donation, the approach by Mr. Huang was clumsily direct. and when it emerged into the public arena, it attracted a lot of negative attention, obviously, and was probably frowned on by the embassy. The Sydney consulate is believed to have been behind a social media campaign urging Chinese Australian voters in a recent by-election, this is last December, a by-election urging the voters to unseat the sitting Conservative member as a way of sending a powerful message about Beijing's capacity to mobilise Chinese Australian voters and also to send a message about the political risks to the government of pursuing the proposed foreign interference legislation, which I'll come to in a moment. So it was a direct, although deniable, interference by the Chinese Communist Party through the embassy and the consulates and United Front organisations in Australia into a democratic process in Australia with a view to sending a strong political message about what happens to a political party if it displeases Beijing. United Front organisations have also taken to encouraging their members to enter politics by joining mainstream parties and running for election at federal and state parliamentary elections. Even local councils can provide experience and contacts. Members are also encouraged to seek positions in politicians' offices, some of whom have been exposed and have had to, much to the embarrassment of their naive employers. ASIO, Australia's foremost intelligence agency, has reportedly identified around 10 political candidates at state and local government elections whom it believes have close ties to Chinese intelligence services. Turning briefly to business elites, over the years, and especially since 2008, the financial crisis, out of which Australia emerged largely unscathed, attributed by many people to our trading relationship with the PRC. But Beijing has created a kind of fifth column among Australia's business elites that can be relied upon to pressure the Australian government from desisting in taking any action that might upset Beijing. Along with the PLA Liaison Department, United Front organisations are active in the business community where influence operations have been supercharged by the rapid growth in trade and investment flows between the two countries. Jerry Groot, perhaps or most certainly Australia's foremost expert on the United Front, he notes that every business person of any substance in China is obliged to be a member of the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce, a United Front body with branches around the world, although sometimes with varying names to disguise their origins and CCP links. To refuse to join the All China Federation invites retribution. So every substantial person from China doing business in Australia has United Front links. And of course the obligations to the party that go with them, which might include gathering information on business and other political affairs, for instance, to feed to the consulates, and cultivating relationships with a view to promoting opinions sympathetic to the PRC. As a result of rubbing shoulders with Chinese counterparts, many leading figures in the Australian business community now serve as megaphones for Beijing's messaging to the Australian government and the wider public, not least in warnings about damaging the relationship and the risks of retaliation when statements are made that Beijing doesn't like. And these voices in Australia are loud, relentless and effective. Powerful industries, including mining, increasingly agriculture or parts of the agricultural sector, tourism and higher education, are now locked into China, and this gives the PRC great leverage over them. This leverage is given more substance by the cultivation of close personal relations through a variety of means. It's easy through these means for the ambassador or a senior diplomat to phone up the head of a mining conglomerate or indeed a university and suggest that the government's latest action, or more likely its latest statement, is unfriendly to the Chinese people, and perhaps he or she should communicate that to the relevant minister or prime minister. This happens frequently. Finally, intellectuals. Scholars are important because they help frame perceptions of China and the CCP's objectives. The most effective means of silencing intellectuals potentially critical of the CCP is to subdue their employers with money. Most universities in Australia are now heavily reliant on Chinese income, both in the form of student fees and, much neglected, the hundreds of research and teaching agreements that Australian universities have with universities in the PRC. Academics know that university administrators from the top down are anxious that nothing should happen on their campuses that may jeopardise the flow of revenue. There have been a number of well-publicised cases of academics issuing grovelling apologies for statements in class that, as the saying goes, hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. Mistakes such as referring to Taiwan as a country or using a map showing India's claim to a disputed border region in the Himalayas rather than China's. Scholars of China are deeply divided, at least their divisions have emerged as being deep in the last month or so, essentially in reaction to my book. But the scholars are deeply divided between those who see no threat and believe that the current debate in Australia should not be taking place, and those who see PRC interference in Australia as a serious problem warranting greater awareness and creative responses. Some in the first group hold their position out of genuine conviction. Others have been actively cultivated as friends of China, many over a long period. Academics are especially vulnerable as they know that criticism of the PRC that crosses certain well-defined lines may lead to the refusal of a visa, which can be career-threatening. And so self-censorship is not uncommon in the scholarly community. The bottom line is that many influential academics and commentators are reliable friends of China. They've created a narrative around the need to avoid angering China, to focus on the economic benefits of the relationship, to downplay instances of interference, and to shift to a more independent foreign policy. You'd be surprised at the number of very influential commentators in Australia who say that we need a more independent foreign policy, which essentially means to distance ourselves from the United States and move ourselves closer to China. In recent years, wealthy businessmen with links to the party have made large donations to Australia's universities, giving them significant influence in them. The most publicised case has been that of Huang Zhangmo, whose donation created a new think tank, the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. Mr. Huang said that he personally chose its director, former Foreign Minister Bob Carr. Carr declared that his institute would take a positive and optimistic view of relations with China. And Bob Carr and his think tank, ACRI, have since become reliable China boosters, with Carr recently quoted as describing Xi Jinping as a truly far-sighted and eminently wise leader. Let me finish with a few remarks on how to respond to the new situation. Australia now leads the Western world in awareness of the PRC's subversive activities. In the government, there's a political will to respond, backed by the public. This awareness follows excellent reporting by a handful of journalists and articles by another handful of China scholars, led in particular by Professor John Fitzgerald. Within government, reports by the intelligence agencies have shifted understanding at the top. In other words, the Prime Minister. ASIO's public reports have been ringing the alarm bells more loudly, albeit without naming the PRC, regrettably in my view. However, political resistance remains, notably from sections of the Australian Labor Party and indeed the business community, led in recent times, it seems, by mining billionaire Andrew Forrest. This will soon come to a head when Parliament debates a new package of proposed laws designed to counter foreign interference operations. The legislation will criminalise certain forms of foreign interference and strengthen espionage offences, establish a foreign influence transparency scheme requiring all those who engage in political activity on behalf of a foreign state or a foreign principal to place their names on a register. It will ban donations to all political campaigning from, quote, foreign bank accounts, non-citizens and foreign entities. And it will require more systematic assessment of the risks of foreign investment in critical infrastructure through the creation of a critical assets register and greater discretion on the part of the minister to ban certain bids for ownership. I think the first of these, I won't go into detail because of time, the foreign interference law, as it's typically known, is particularly important because it attempts for the first time anywhere to come to grips with the specific nature of United Front operations and to define them in a way that they can be codified and criminalised. Responding to the PRC's foreign interference operations requires that we upturn the way we think about diplomacy. While the PRC uses the same tools as the United States or Australia to apply pressure on other nations to achieve its diplomatic goals, it has several other powerful weapons at its disposal for subduing other nations. These weapons are aimed not at applying outside pressure to those other nations, but at eroding resistance from within. The PRC is always looking for ways of infiltrating the political, economic and social institutions, not to mention military and intelligence ones, of its opponents to white ant them. While the PRC is working on, let's say, an 8-track campaign, we're stuck with a traditional 1 or 2. So to finish, although the party's subversive weapons have been deployed for decades in East and Southeast Asia, they have begun to be deployed intensively against Western nations only in the last 10 or 15 years. And the West doesn't know how to think about them and has little experience with how to protect itself from this kind of subversion. If they are to resist CCP influence and interference, democracies in the West and indeed in Asia will need to develop new tools and new institutions. Australia's new foreign interference laws, now before Parliament, potentially represent a large step forward as they will criminalise a range of United Front activities that cannot be captured by the espionage laws. At this stage, it's impossible to assess how effective they'll be once they are passed and then enforced, and indeed the enforcement agencies, I'm told, are geared up and ready to go. But it's no surprise that other democracies are watching what is unfolding in Australia very intently indeed. I'll finish there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Now we have an opportunity for a conversation, and I thought I would abuse the privilege of the chair by asking the first question. And you already sort of answered part of it, which is you gave a diagnosis in the book, and I thought an extensive diagnosis. Now I think we're starting to get to the prescription. I think you've done a good job of bringing us up to date of current proposals in Australia, but do you think that's sufficient, or do you think more is needed to really deal with this? And I would say, as you pointed out, I think Australia is, in some ways, head and shoulders above the United States in diagnosing the problem, and now and now acting on it. Where do you see that, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, thanks, Tom. This is, of course, the big question. As I see it, these new foreign interference laws, plus the other laws that are going with it, are really a kind of decisive step in trying to come to grips with the nature of CCP interference in democratic processes. You'll notice from that slide I put up that they're very specifically targeted at attempts to influence government processes and the exercise of democratic rights. And they have all sorts of implications. We wrote a submission, when I say we, Alex Josky, my researcher, and myself, to the parliamentary inquiry into these new laws, where we noted 8, I think it was, kind of stylised examples of United Front and other influence operations based on events that had actually occurred in Australia, and asked, will the new legislation pick these up and send people potentially to jail if they continue to do them? And some of them would almost certainly be picked up by the laws, although we have to yet see how the courts might interpret them. But others, being more subtle and harder to define, are in legal terms at least, would probably escape. But I see these laws as being really only the first step. I think it requires a wholesale reorientation of how we think about relationships with the PRC. The bottom line of all of this is the message to the CCP is, look, if you want a harmonious, sustainable, long-term relationship with Australia, which is what I want, everybody wants, I imagine, then butt out. Get out of our democracy. Stop meddling. Engage in traditional diplomatic practices by all means. But and this is an opportunity to try and get them begin the process of getting them out. But I think what we will need, and this is a much more difficult to define and long-term process, is a kind of broad social understanding of the nature of these influence operations, which go beyond the laws themselves and result in civil responses to this kind of interference.
Sir.
Clive Hamilton, I'm struck by your country's willingness to pass the law. The law seems as though it's designed to be punitive, but also defensive. In my opinion, of strong defenses is without offense, you're just going to take a little longer to die. So my question is, what's the offensive side of this, which causes people themselves push back rather than government push back? Because you've got to influence the people to succeed in this effort.
And I neglected two pieces of business. One, if you could please introduce yourself in asking the question.
My apologies. Mike Carnes, retired Air Force.
Thank you, Jim. And also just speak up. Although we do have microphones in the ceiling, so that's what the little lights are for. So, but thank you.
That's a fantastic question. It's an American question, if I can put it that way.
You're going through the same thing.
Yes, you are, absolutely. And, that chart I showed of United Front activity, I'm sure someone here could draw up something that looked extremely similar for the United States. I was speaking a week ago at the CSIS in Ottawa, intelligence agency there, and I made the same point that someone should draw up one for Canada. It would be almost exactly like that, although some of the details would differ, of course. But that's a great question. It's very important for people like me to say that we are not attempting to change the regime in China. What we're trying to do is to protect Australia from PRC influence in our polity, in our institutions, in our democracy. So in that sense, it's a defensive strategy. But I take your argument about the need for offence. And I think offence in this context, you mentioned kind of mobilise the people, if we can put it that way, which is my commentary about civil society. This is an extremely difficult, potentially dangerous thing to do. I've been attacked by pro-Beijing people for promoting xenophobia in Australia and racism, even though the day I decided to write this book was the day that I started thinking about this problem and how to avoid it, and why I very explicitly went out of my way to make sure that Chinese Australian voices are reflected in my book. And I've got a pretty good record on anti-racism. I mean, I come from the left of the political spectrum, which is kind of odd for many people. But the other offensive aspect of responding to the PRC is developing the international relationships in order to prevent the PRC from its traditional approach of divide and rule. And that means, for example, the Quad, I think, is particularly important. And the alliance of the democratic nations, in this case India, Japan, Australia and the United States, as a way of countering the kind of influence and interference activities that the PRC has been allowed to get away with, particularly in the South China Sea and its bullying of Southeast Asian nations. I think that kind of pushback is absolutely essential. We simply can't allow the PRC to effectively annex the entire South China Sea and exclude other nations. You'll be aware that week before last, 3 Australian Navy ships were steaming peacefully and entirely legally across the South China Sea when they were confronted by the PLA Navy, and who demanded to know what we were doing there. Well, we're doing what we've always done, what other navies do, steaming in international waters. But that kind of aggressive posture, I swore I'd never start using the word posture, of the PLA Navy is part of the strategy, and if we succumb to it, then we're lost.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Sandy. I'm from the State Department. You talked about a variety of methods that China's using in its influence campaigns, from using Chinese students and overseas citizens, controlling hometown newspapers, outright bribes and donations. One thing I didn't hear you mention was cyber. And I'm curious if you've come across the use of cyber capabilities in these influence campaigns, or if that seems to be a technology that's not being utilized.
Yeah, thanks for that. I know that's a particularly sensitive one in the context of Russia. We haven't seen, it's kind of different in Australia. We certainly haven't seen the kind of interference that Russia undertook in the last presidential election. However, as you know, the Communist Party controls, through the propaganda department, all Chinese language social media platforms, Weibo and WeChat, and most Chinese Australians use those social media platforms, especially younger ones, and so there has definitely been political interference in the communications between Australian citizens on matters that Beijing takes an interest in. I mean, this in itself is a fundamental attack on Australian democracy. Why are we allowing a foreign power to control the communications that take place between Australian citizens? It happens. We need to do something about that. What the answer is, I'm not too sure. And in that context, I mentioned the by-election that the embassy, or rather the consulate, got involved in. The way they got involved in it was through the use of social media, and in particular a kind of ultra-patriotic rant that went around quite widely, I believe, amongst Chinese Australian voters in this electorate where, obviously, there was a very high proportion of Chinese Australians on the electoral rolls. And it seems likely that it wasn't just a United Front organisation that put together and circulated that attack on the Turnbull government, which was, used the strongest possible language, but in fact the consulate was instrumental in organising it. So there you had the Chinese government, in effect, through the consulate and United Front operatives trying to influence the outcome of an election. They didn't succeed in the sense that they didn't get the Labor candidate elected, but they did manage to shift the Chinese-Australian vote very considerably.
Sir.
Bill Sutton with Northrop Grumman. This seems to be a very different campaign than everything we talked about from the Russians. Is that because of the environment, because of the relatively large number of Chinese-Australian residents and citizens? Or is it because they have a better chance here in Australia of influencing elites? Does this seem to be around aimed at elite campaign that seems to use the Chinese, resident Chinese, or use Chinese for that?
Yes, whereas Russia doesn't try anything like that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, of course, we don't have the Russia issue in Australia. It's just not there. In fact, I went to Russia for the first time actually last year, November or something like that, and I went to the Russian embassy, and I grew up in Canberra. I can remember the kind of power that used to emanate out of the Russian embassy and the fear it could inspire. This was during the Cold War, but now it's clearly a place where people are sent for a vacation posting, and it was kind of hopeless. Look, but even in the United States, people are completely preoccupied with Russia. Russia is not the big threat. China is the big threat. Really, Russia's in 2016 figures, GDP was $1.3 trillion US. Australia's GDP, 1.3 trillion, the same. That's how big the Russian economy is, the same as Australia's. But as by 2030, according to the projections, China's economy will be 40% bigger than that of the United States. But the more important thing, well, that's obviously crucially important, but the more important thing is, what does Putin want? He wants to destabilize, he wants to show that Russia matters, he wants to grandstand, he wants to punish Hillary Clinton, but then what? Nothing. But what does China want? Here we've got something completely different. It doesn't want to destabilize Western democracies. It wants them stable. It wants to infiltrate them and control them. Its view is not for the next presidential election. It thinks 10, 20, 30, 2049. And it has a salami slicing, campaign, generally pushing, getting away with it, pushing a bit more, getting away with it, more and more infiltration, more and more influence. And so China is it's happy to sign a cyber agreement with President Obama. We'll stop our cyber spying on you, kinda. But they they agreed to do that because they have plenty of other ways of interfering and gaining control. So China is a completely different kettle of fish, and Russia is a distraction, really. And it's good to see in the few days I've been in Washington and speaking around the place just how many clever, engaged people recognise that. And the sooner the United States gets over its Russia problem, the more the US will be able to focus on the real long-term problem.
Yeah. Actually, I think your question is a really good one, and maybe to give a different perspective or a complementary perspective on it. Actually, I think one of the things that's struck me, and I think struck us as we've been doing the work here at CSBA on both Russian and Chinese political warfare, is at least in terms of the strategies and, if you will, the tactics employed, actually a lot of similarities. Although obviously the manifestation, say in Australia or the United States or elsewhere, could be quite different. And I guess the more you think about it, it's not hard to see why there are similarities, and it is it's that common communist heritage. Obviously, Russia's not a communist state anymore, but still following a lot of ways following the playbook of active measures and a lot of that was done during the Cold War. The Chinese Communist Party is still following that playbook. So I think it's one of these glass half full, glass half empty type of things, and I think, yeah, certainly in, you know, from Australia's perspective, Russia doesn't loom large, you know, and other places Russia looms larger, but the comparative study of political warfare and economic statecraft, I think, is a topic for some real fruitful scholarship. I think you're leading the way in a lot of ways for that, for better and worse.
Yes.
Sir.
Dick Thornton, George Washington University. I noticed in your organizational chart you had the Confucius Institute. How do they operate in Australia?
Identically to the way they operate in the United States. Incidentally, there was a brilliant short article by John Fitzgerald, whom I mentioned, who's probably Australia's leading sinologist, about why Confucius Institutes are there and how they operate, which came out, was published in one of the newspapers a couple of months ago, which for me just lent a level of subtlety to my understanding. I urge you to try and track it down. There are 14 Confucius Institutes operating in campuses in Australia, including 6 of the so-called Group of 8, the more prestigious universities which are particularly targeted. It's the topic that universities don't really want to talk about. It's once you've got one, you need to defend it. We've seen individual scholars in Australia with Chinese expertise say we really shouldn't be hosting these institutions, but this is awkward for the universities. There have been, I know, a couple of universities that have been approached and have turned them down because of the kind of objections that have been raised by the important report in the United States by the, what's the organisation, a kind of Conservative Scholars Association, but more particularly in Canada. I noted that the letter signed by Chairman Rubio and co-chairman Smith to universities in Texas, I think, calling on them to close down their Confucius Institutes. I'd hope that similar pressure starts to mount in Australia.
So, sir.
Hi, Brendan Mulvaney from the China Aerospace Studies Institute. So last year, the Department of Defense and office commissioned an outside study for some business leaders to look at the China problem here in the United States, China issue here in the U.S. And they came back shocked to find out that China had a strategy to invest in the U.S. and take over companies and things like that. And they presented it, and the audience was largely made up of DOD and some congressional people who kind of said, yeah, we know all that. So they were absolutely shocked to find that. So I guess my question is, in Australia, do you get the feeling that, so my feeling is your book's major contribution is just letting people know that this is going on. Do you have a feeling for how prevalent that feeling is currently, given the fact that the problems you had just getting the book published? Are people able to kind of get the information out there, or is it still kind of this nebulous thing off in the corner that nobody's really talking about?
That's a really good question. Let me give a general and a specific answer to that. The general answer is not that I would have asked for it, because it's been an extremely unpleasant experience, but the truth is when you ban a book, everybody wants to read it. And so, you know, it's kind of marketing gold to have trouble getting your book published. There's a nice little kind of side story to this, and that is the publisher, Hardy Grant, which is a small but very well regarded publisher in Australia. It doesn't publish this kind of book at all. But one of the principals is Sandy Grant, who was a publisher at Heinemann, big publisher in the 1980s, which wanted to publish a book, the book by Peter Wright, the former MI5 spy, called Spycatcher. And the British government wanted to suppress it. And there was a major court case in Australia, I think it was 1987, and Heinemann, Sandy Grant, commissioned as their barrister to argue their case a young gun barrister named Malcolm Turnbull. So there's kind of nice circularity in the whole thing. My sense since the book has come out, signing scores of them from an eager public in Australia, is a widespread sense in Australia that there's something wrong, there's something going on. And they've picked up a kind of suspicion or a worry about the influence of the PRC through a range of issues that have popped up. It might be Chinese companies buying up regional airports and establishing pilot training schools there. Senator Sam Dastyari giving counter-surveillance advice to Huang Jiangmo, leave your phone inside Jiangmo and come outside, I need to tell you something. As it happens, somebody was listening. Or a Chinese state-owned company buying up half of the electricity infrastructure in Victoria, or agricultural land. And so what this book does is explain it all. This is what's happening. This is why. It's across the board. It's linked. It's not accidental. And I think that's why the book has really resonated with the public. The specific answer is this. My researcher, Alex Josky, and I discovered, and we published this in a couple of newspaper articles last year, and it's in the book, although in adumbrated form, that companies with links to PLA research were funding research projects at Australian universities. We also discovered that there were dozens of, we don't know how many, but at least dozens, of scientists working at PLA universities, because in China they have universities who are part of the PLA structure, who are scientists at PLA universities in China, and so actually with military rank, although they don't boast about it, although occasionally you can find photos of them wearing their uniforms. So these scientists working in labs in Australia, or publishing articles in collaboration with Australian scientists on matters that have military applications. So when we discovered this and said, the story was Australian scientists working with PLA on military-related matters, some of which was funded directly by the Australian government, what the hell is going on? The universities were shocked. The government was shocked. The Minister for Education demanded to know what was going on. The government funding agency was shocked. I think even ASIO was shocked. So there's new stuff kind of emerging that's making people wake up and think, whoa, what's going on here? There's some program going on very deeply within our universities and other institutions that we really need to know more about.
Sir.
Nicholas Romero, representing myself. My question is, Vanuatu was recently in the press earlier this month, and my question is, Australia is a mature democracy. And we rely on Australia to serve as a sort of canary in the coal mine for what's going on in Oceania and South Pacific. And I was wondering if your book has gotten any traction throughout the region, for instance, or if you've maybe seen an opportunity to pursue research throughout the South Pacific or Southeast Asia and examine how China is influencing other countries.
Yes. Well, certainly. Let me stick with the Pacific. A week or so after my book came out, I was doing a radio interview, and I speculated, but in the most tentative terms, about the vague possibility that maybe in 10 or 20 years' time, who knows, maybe the China will try to establish some kind of military base in, Fiji or the Solomon Islands. And I thought, whoa, I hope I haven't gone over the top there. Lo and behold, 2 months later, massive front-page news story, despite the denials. I think senior defence intelligence people in Australia knew that these private discussions have been going on between the PRC and the government of Vanuatu. I mean, 270,000 people, I think, is the population of Vanuatu. It's pretty easy to buy off a political system like that if other powers are neglecting it, as indeed Australia and New Zealand have been doing, because those Pacific Islands are the backyard of Australia and New Zealand, have always been so regarded. We've been the major aid donors and so on. So this was nevertheless a great shock, and there's no doubt that it, despite the denials, that the PRC has been testing the waters, as it were, you can imagine the strategic importance of having a PLA Navy base in Vanuatu. I mean, the symbolic significance of having a Navy base in the Western Pacific looking across the waters to the United States is extremely significant. And the direct strategic influence of having the PLA Navy ensconced on an island, essentially covering that vast part of the Pacific to Australia's northeast, is profound. We have been reducing our aid commitment. We've been focusing on other parts of the world. We, Australia, really need to get far more serious about the Pacific, if only setting aside humanitarian goals, if only to protect our strategic interests and to signal to the United States that, yep, we've got it covered. We don't have it covered. And the PRC is extremely adept at picking out weaknesses and going in and exploiting them.
Thanks.
Oh, I should just say there, Anne-Marie Brady, the New Zealand academic, is particularly important. She's probably the foremost expert in this. She wrote a brilliant piece which appeared only a couple of weeks ago about the PRC's penetration of Vanuatu and other islands in the Pacific.
Excellent. Any other questions? Ma'am.
Speak up. I know last week you were at the congressional hearing, CECC's hearing, and sharing the book. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, do you think the Western society, the democracies, can work together to against this infiltration or influence operation of CCP? Can we work together to push back?
Yeah, I think the Western democracies and indeed Asian democracies do need to work together much more to push back against PRC influence. It's not a question of containing China. They freak out about that. It's a question of limiting the influence of the PRC in the democratic processes so that those nations can maintain their sovereignty. But before the kind of collaboration can happen, and I mentioned the Quad, which, if it goes ahead, is a very important stepping stone in that, there needs to be a common understanding and acceptance of the nature and extent of the threat. And I think that started to happen only in the last year or two, which is why what's happened in Australia has been particularly important, because, as I said, I think because we're at the forefront of the PRC interference operations, we are now at the forefront of awareness of it, perhaps with the exception of New Zealand. That's another case. But, of course, what we're seeing in Australia is a great deal of pushback. We're seeing just how effective the PRC's interference operations have been, how effective they have captured certain elements of the elites, and how they are fighting back wittingly or otherwise on behalf of Beijing. So there's a question of whether in Australia Beijing has engaged in overreach, and I think it probably has, given the resentment that has started to build up in parts of the Australian community, the political willingness to introduce new legislation, and the heightened awareness in many parts of Australia to these kinds of influence operations. So I hope that what Australia is doing, including some Australian journalists and the government and my book, are kind of a warning to other nations that this is what you need to look out for, and as soon as you start looking, you see it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for this conversation. For those of you who haven't read the book yet, I highly recommend it. And I know Professor Hamilton will stick around for a few minutes, and there's still some food and drink. And but we'll bring the formal part of the program to a close here. Please join me in thanking Professor Clive Hamilton.